Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on research methodology in history. Today, we will be learning about history and science. Science and history have always shared a very complex relationship. For significant parts of the 18th and 19th centuries, historians were determined to prove that history itself is a science. Historians were dazzled by the status and infallibility of the natural sciences, as well as the tides of rising secularization driving away the ideas of divine influence in history. Therefore, a major theme of this discussion will be the debate surrounding the status of history as a science. At the same time, historians were writing histories of science, which has a historiography of its own, and that theme too will be discussed here. Scholars have commented on how historians in Europe in the 19th century seem to be infected by the spirit of conquest that natural science seemed to embody. Just as sciences like physics and chemistry seem to promise the complete conquest of the natural world, history too aimed to conquer the historical world. Historians like Michelet commented on history being able to have complete knowledge of the past. Mommsen commented that scientific historiography could produce comprehensive, objective, truthful knowledge about the past. Even into the 20th century, philosophers like Collingwood were talking about a historical science. We must try to understand the origins of the sentiment and how it took shape. During the Renaissance, history was seen as more literary, connected to rhetoric, and hence not a science. It was only in the 18th century that the claims of history to being a science were first articulated. But such an idea was not accepted in the Encyclopedia of Diderot. Historical science was seen as a contradiction. In the German intellectual world, even though history was seen as empirical knowledge, it was not even seen as systematic knowledge, let alone a science. By the late 18th century, we see the rise in physical sciences, and this created a change. Physical science changed the way in which knowledge was evaluated. Concrete empirical knowledge combined with the inductive method of reasoning was seen to be vital. It was in this context that history was first claimed as a science. In the 19th century, we see strong articulate claims for history being a science, with the innovations of the German historical method lending such claims legitimacy. Two interpretations of history laid claim to being a science. The first approach employed hermeneutics and idiographic approaches. This was highly professional historiography identified with the German historical school, and its claim was that the historical science it dealt in was entirely distinct from literature, from the philosophies of history, which were seen as speculative, and all the Enlightenment-style history that had preceded it. Its method was rooted in careful, methodical archival work with the aim to produce objective knowledge. The other approach to history derived from positivism. It was principally the domain of amateurs, and hence, compared to the German historical school, it found itself marginalized. In recent times, the term positivist history has been used in an almost derisive way to indicate excessively fact and event-oriented history. But in the 19th century, positivist history was based on a theoretical model that advanced certain laws of progressive development. However, very few, if any, professional historians actually tried to put this theoretical model into practice. In the 20th century, however, there was a misclassification. The philosopher of history, Collingwood, combined three completely different intellectual phenomena. The positivist school of philosophy, most articulately defended by French philosopher Auguste Comte and his very few followers among the historians, with the English empiricist tradition of history and the German historical school established and made famous by Ranke and his followers. This ahistorical conflation of positivist with totally different phenomena has even been perpetuated by later authors like E. H. Carr and Stedman Jones. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary for us to untangle this problem and look at the positivist history writings in their own historical context. So now we move on to positivist historiography. It was the assumption of Enlightenment philosophers like Condorcet that if human beings were evaluated as part of the natural world and their basic needs like food and shelter were historically fixed, then it should be possible to generalize laws of human behavior through which the future of societies could be predicted and policy be formulated accordingly. 19th century thinkers like Comte, Buckle, Spencer, and Taine believed in this enterprise of framing the laws of human behavior. They put their faith in history. The idea behind this enterprise was to frame a set of natural laws that could describe and predict the behavior of human beings, and thus prove once and for all the science of history. Thus, the positivist historians dedicated themselves to searching for these laws and tried to write histories that would enable people to make predictions based on these laws. Their numbers were few and their historical contribution ultimately not very significant, but they were able to critique the dominant Rankian paradigm. Of these positivist historians, Henry Thomas Buckle was one of the most notable, and he was a historian of England. He denounced the narrow method of history writing that was content with just narrating events punctuated by occasionally small amounts of speculation or commentary. This sort of history writing was, in his opinion, damaging the entire discipline. Thus, he set his mind to finding the patterns of regularity which surely governed the workings of nature and society. This to him was true scientific history, and he intended to use scientific techniques normally used in geology, statistics, and meteorology to achieve his ends. In his landmark 2-volume History of Civilization in England, published between 1856 and 1861, he argued that there was nothing mysterious guiding human destiny, and that it was the duty of everyone to decide whether fixed laws or chance influenced history. Instead of focusing on political or diplomatic history, he emphasized the history of art, science, and culture. At the same time, in France, Hippolyte Taine argued for the demystification of the past. He too argued for the methods of the natural sciences to be applied to history, and to him, history was basically a natural science itself. He was looking for the forces that guided history, with his aim being to achieve the same level of precision as the natural sciences. He argued that geography, race, and the momentum of past events were the essential forces guiding human history. In this enterprise, he received the support of social scientists like Emil Durkheim, who were highly interested in creating a system of universal laws and causality for human society. This movement had a counterpart in Germany, where Karl Lamprecht set himself against the prevailing historical orthodoxy of political diplomatic history. He set himself against the establishment of German history, and he argued against this narrow individual-oriented history and tried to make the case for a broader cultural history which would try to identify the general laws of human behavior by paying attention to the entire breadth of human experience. His arguments, unfortunately, were dismissed by other German historians. Now, we must look at the science of history in the 19th century. Even as the professional historians mostly dismissed the efforts of the positivists, they characterized their own field of scholarship, which was narrow, archive-oriented, political diplomatic history, as historical science or science of history. This pattern of professional practice was evident throughout the Western world. Ranke led the way in Germany. To him, history was both science and art. He emphasized the role of historian to be the patient and meticulous gatherer of information, to be impartial arbiter who would write history without bias or preference. Therefore, the historian must try to produce the objective truth, and this was only possible when the historian had a pure love of truth. To Ranke, the archives were the principal repositories of information. There were the means through which secondary sources could be checked and verified. And to him, this ability to use the archive as essentially a touchstone of truth made history a scientific endeavor. This German model became dominant in Europe and gained followers in all countries. In France, historians like Gabriel Monod dedicated their lives to transforming French historiography following the German model. He established the journal which was called the Historical Review, and he wrote a book on historiography called Masters of History. Following his leadership, state-sponsored history writing of what would come to be known as the methodic school dominated French academia, with historians producing empirical histories like History of France, General History, and People and Civilization. However, underneath this empirical approach, there remained a strong national sentiment. In Britain, historians like Lord Acton and Richard Simpson rejected Buckle's positivist approach for ignoring the individual and divine providence. Acton repeatedly emphasized the importance of centering the individual in any enterprise of history. The Rankian scientific history, combined with some positivist elements, came to be dominant in Britain soon. This was best expressed by J.B. Bury's lecture on the science of history, which was delivered at the turn of the century. According to Bury, the German method of being exactly in conformity with the facts made possible the indisputable status of history as science. He repeatedly emphasized the need to completely reject all older notions of the literariness of history. To him, scientificity was attainable through meticulous research into facts, and objectivity in historical scholarship was absolutely vital. In America, the German method took hold very rapidly after 1870. American historians were being trained in German universities and were bringing home the German notions of objectivity and scientific history. History was seen as being fundamentally distinct from literature, poetry, or politics. The emphasis was on showing how things actually were, on using and replicating a rigorous scientific method. Science itself was seen as extremely prestigious, and hence it was absolutely essential that history be scientific. The German emphasis on the historical seminar was also carried over, with historians like H.B. Adams going so far as to design the perfect seminar room and preparing maps showing sites of historical seminars across the world. Scientific vocabulary like laboratories were very much in vogue, and the ideas of Darwin became very influential. The American Historical Association, founded in 1894, adopted scientific history as its mission and set Ranke as its ideal. Now that we have seen the situation of scientific history in the 19th century, we need to look at two of its important features separately. One was the idea of objectivity in history, and the other was the method of scientific history. So now we will look at the concept of objectivity in history. Objectivity was the hallmark of scientific history. The historian was seen as impartial, as a neutral judge who would forever preserve balance in the historical narrative. The highest ideal of objectivity was to erase all personal touches from the historical narrative, to such an extent that a narrative of an event would be intelligible and acceptable to all parties, even those with mutually opposed interests. The fact was the heart of objectivity. Derived from the Latin factum, which meant something definitely done, this word ironically had a measure of ambiguity, as there was some debate about whether the etymology referred to the deed itself or a statement judging that the deed had been done. To remove all possibilities of subjectivity, all source documents were to be subjected to philological criticism, and once the authenticity of the documents was established, then the facts would be allowed to speak for themselves. Thus, in this model, the facts in the sources made up the historical world, which could be sensed by the historian, who would then use his methodology to frame it as a history. Now we will look at the method of scientific history. Method was absolutely crucial to scientific history, and at its heart lay inductive reasoning. Facts were to be gathered, their authenticity verified, and then generalization could be achieved on their basis. Inductive reasoning was seen as very prestigious and effective, as Darwin himself had apparently used it. In the late 19th century, manuals of historical method were composed for the benefit of the students. The two most well-known were Ernst Bernheim's textbook on historical method and Charles Langlois and Charles Sinobos's Introduction to Historical Studies. These manuals argued that even though humanity is not entirely the same everywhere, the processes of thinking, perception, and conceptualization are mostly the same. And so, if there is a firm basis of knowledge or a data set, then history can strive for the truthful knowledge produced by the other sciences. In the manual Introduction to Historical Studies, the confidence of late 19th century historians is best represented. They believed that documents could reveal the entire truth of the past, and so documentary analysis was the primary avenue of inquiry for historical studies. Each document must be critically analyzed if it was to be used as a source. Oral culture, myths, legends, etc. were to be entirely disregarded. Documents were seen to be psychological traces of the past, and in their absence, there can be no history. Since history could not directly observe its subject matter, unlike the other sciences, documents were the only traces, and history was therefore a science of reasoning that came to its conclusions based on the study of these traces. Of course, these historians were not naively accepting anything stated in the documents as truth. They suggested a very rigorous method of critical analysis. Of course, criticism by itself cannot prove a fact. It merely suggests probabilities regarding the veracity of the documents. Each statement needed to be corroborated with multiple independent sources. A harmony of facts needed to be established through which there could be certainty, and only then could there said to be a body of science as opposed to an incoherent collection of facts. Now, despite these claims to impartiality and objectivity, history became nationalistic, biased, and Eurocentric. History was propping up the state, promoting national and imperial agendas, and entirely ignoring the histories of the non-Western world. This so-called scientific history was inevitably laden with the political and cultural biases of its time. Thus, the attempts to make history into a science were to no avail. Having completed this discussion, we must now look at history of science. While there were various attempts to write the history of scientific developments in the 18th and the 19th centuries, it was the 20th century which saw the emergence of history of science as a discipline. Therefore, we will need to understand the process of its emergence and maturation in the context of the 20th century. The first phase. The central figure in the emergence of the history of science as a discipline was George Sarton, a professor at Harvard University. Through his essays about the relevance and method of the field, his programs of study and teaching, his mentoring of the next generation of scholars, his establishment and editorship of the journal ISIS, Sarton played the foundational role in the history of science. Now, Sarton saw science as the only field of human enterprise that had seen serious, measurable progress. And it was this progress and its impact on other fields that had caused the improvement in human life and society. Science, thus, was crucial and needed to be protected from misuse and malpractice. He was extremely wary of scientists who would become too arrogant or be overcome by hubris. He felt new forms of institutional control were required, and in this context he proposed that a new historical consciousness could function as a form of control. Now, in the old humanism, there were three categories: the natural, the human, and the superhuman, with superhuman being seen as the highest category. But Sarton proposed a new humanism where there would be only two categories, natural and human, with both enjoying equal status. He felt that a combined, balanced study of both these fields would protect humanity from the technocratic dominance of arrogant scientists. Sarton felt that the history of science could play a very crucial role in this scheme. He argued that just as science concentrated on the study of the natural, history would study science itself and act as a critique of the works of the scientists. This continuous process of criticism and evaluation would serve as a check on the dangers of unchecked growth of knowledge and technology. The ability of the historian to place the actions of scientists in the broader historical context would supersede the debates within the scientific community. The historian would thus also be acting as a guardian by critiquing the tradition, by pointing out superstition, error, or undue arrogance. The historian would also be highlighting the human dimension that scientists might be too narrowly focused to see. Thus, the historian's broad general view would act as a way to put all scientific development into proper perspective. This ambitious program did have great influence at Cambridge, where the history of science started to be practiced. Historians like Alexander Coir, E. A. Burt, and E. J. Dexter-Huys were influenced by his ideas. In their writings, we find echoes of Sarton's idea that science was humanity's most successful enterprise. But we also see fears that the overdominance of science has led to a kind of spiritual poverty. Thus, books like The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Physical Science by Burt tried to link developments in science with the great philosophical developments of different historical periods. Coir had similar ideas, and in his work, he tried to relate scientific developments with contemporary philosophical developments. Thus, for him, 17th century scientific breakthroughs were connected to the rise of Neoplatonism. Of course, this was not an easy path. There were a number of challenges and changes. The first challenge was the universalist aspirations of the history of science, and which was met with the increasing specialization and the complexity of the sciences. It was felt that it was basically impossible for historians to have the specialized knowledge required to ably appraise and write the histories of all the various disciplines and sub-disciplines of science. Scientists felt that historians lacked the knowledge to make informed critiques and were speaking from a position of ignorance. Historians felt that scientists were either ignorant of or were actively ignoring the broader context for the development of science. The second challenge was towards the enterprise of setting up a generalist interpretation of scientific progress as prescribed by Sarton. Any kind of general conclusion is dependent on a thorough knowledge of the primary sources and the particulars of the various fields. But with the dramatic expansion of both sources and the various fields and subfields, such a general interpretation became an impossible task. The third challenge, or the point of tension, was regarding the relationship between the historiography and the philosophy of science. While philosophy was immensely important in the original scheme, and the philosophy of science was seen as the mother discipline of the history of science, in recent years, historians have tried to distance themselves from such a historiography and philosophy as a whole. However, they have not replaced this with independent historical scholarship, but rather have collaborated with other social sciences like sociology and anthropology. Alongside these challenges were the changes in the profession after the Second World War. While history of science became rapidly more popular, in the initial stage at least, it was not very sophisticated. However, with the rise of the new generation of historians and the need to critique science in the context of the devastation of the Second World War, a new level of sophistication came to be noted. There was an emphasis on understanding past science on its own terms. One of the most well-known models for studying this was the notion of the paradigm by Thomas Kuhn. He argued that a scientific paradigm is a closed system with its own theories, methods, and standards, which are all informed by a set of values, principles, and assumptions, which are again in turn based on socio-cultural factors. When this paradigm shifts to a new paradigm, there is a complete change in the perspective of even fundamental concepts. And thus, this new paradigm has to be studied again on its own terms. Even this model has been critiqued by later historians who have emphasized the need for concrete, localized research, focusing on the interactions between people and things. This naturalized process focuses on man-nature interaction, social interaction, psychological and historical factors. And now we can come to our conclusion. These recent enterprises have been criticized for sometimes being too empiricist or almost emulating the obsolete Rankian method of historical scholarship. It has been suggested that contrary to the efforts of many historians, the history of science can never truly be an independent discipline, and nor should it try to be. Its value lies in its position as a bridge between history and the sciences. In such a context, its association with philosophy is indispensable, as without that, there cannot be an analytical framework. Innovative methods like comparative historiography need to be explored. We can thus conclude that the question of the relationship between history and science is an extremely complex one that is still under much development and consideration. Thank you.